Hi everybody, it's Dr. Mike coming to you live from beautiful downtown West Newbury, Massachusetts. I wanted to do a video blog addressing the issue of clinical trials. In particular, I wanted to talk a little bit about the system that we have in place now for conducting clinical trials, and this applies to the US, Canada, Europe, and a lot of Western countries. There used to be some significant differences between the way drugs got approved in the various countries, but those have largely been harmonized across different countries, so it's more or less the same with some minor variations. So one of our goals, of course, is to get new treatments for Fragile X approved, and the basic kinds of treatments that we're looking at fall into two broad categories. One would be available drugs that have particular uses in Fragile X, hopefully to actually treat the underlying causes of Fragile X and not just symptomatic improvement. Obviously, we have a number of psychiatric drugs and wrote a whole book about that, so you can read about that anytime. But we're talking about drugs that are available that may have effects on the underlying biology of Fragile X. And right now, it looks like we have some very good leads. As you probably know, we've done clinical trials of lithium and minocycline, and those are very promising. The trials that have been done are very small, and we probably need to do some larger trials to really thoroughly establish their efficacy. But so far, so good. When you have an available drug, you can simply fund an investigator to do a trial, and they can recruit subjects, and as long as they get it approved by their ethics panel, usually called an IRB or Institutional Review Board, they can conduct a clinical trial without really asking for anybody else's permission. But of course, we're interested in some new drugs that are not available, what some people might call experimental drugs. And those are the kinds of studies that are typically conducted by drug companies and regulated extensively by, in the US anyway, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and there are similar organizations in most other countries. So this is really a big deal when you have what's called an investigational new drug, or IND. You need to jump through all kinds of hoops. It's very expensive and it's very difficult. And the way the whole process breaks down is into three basic stages called Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3. Now this assumes that you've already done all the basic testing in animal models and all the kinds of toxicology that they need before you can actually proceed to human trials, and that's pretty extensive. But once you've done that, you start out by conducting a Phase 1 trial of your drug, which means that you take that drug and you test it in normal volunteers. So these are people who don't have the disease that you're trying to get the drug approved for. They're just normal folks, typically medical students actually, who volunteer to take part in the trial. And they typically get one dose, sometimes a series of doses, and usually it's a escalating dose, so maybe the first few folks will get a low dose and then they'll move up to medium doses, and if nothing really bad happens, they'll go up into high doses in these normal volunteers to see if they can kind of push the envelope and see what sorts of side effects they get. So after you do this, and assuming that nobody dies or has any really bad effects from the medication, you move on to Phase 2 trials. And Phase 2 trials actually involve the target patient population. So in our case, Fragile X patients. Now, even when you get into Phase 2 or later stages of the trials, we're often talking about adult patients, especially in the first round of trials, because for ethical reasons, we typically don't want to start with children. So one of the more frequent questions I get is, Do I think that the medications we're talking about for Fragile X will work in adults? And the answer that I typically give is, well, they'll have to if they're going to get on the market, because most of the trials are going to be done in adults for ethical reasons. Now, if a drug can prove itself effective in adults, then the company may elect to do further studies in children, but it's rare that a drug will be marketed just for children. So even if you think a drug is going to be more effective if given at an earlier age, the drug company will typically get the drug approved initially for use in adult patients. Now sometimes they skip that later part that comes when it comes to getting the drug approved for use in children, and there's a little bit of a pressure on pharmaceutical companies now to go ahead and do those studies in pediatric populations, which they should, especially if they have a reasonable expectation that the drug is going to be used in pediatric populations. So phase 2 trials tend to be larger than phase 1. A typical phase 1 trial will be anywhere from 5 to 20 patients, and the FDA will typically tell you how many patients it expects you to use depending on the anticipated market size for the drug. Likewise, the phase 2 trials can vary in size, anywhere from 20 to 100 or more patients. But in the case of some of the Fragile X trials, we're usually looking at something on the order of 50 to 75 patients for a phase 2 trial. And then when you get past phase 2, you move into a phase 3 trial where you get a larger population of patients, sometimes treated for longer periods of time. And whereas the phase 2 trial is designed to test the safety of the drug in the target population and to begin to look at efficacy, and it often involves some dose-finding studies, phase 3 is really looking very strongly at efficacy. So once you get to phase 3, you need to actually start to show that your drug works in this population. It's really treating the condition that you want to get it indicated for. And this is where you really have to prove that to the FDA's satisfaction, or you don't get your drug approved at all. Phase 3 trials tend to be much larger, so for Fragile X, we're looking for studies of, say, 200 patients, and that usually means multi-center trials. They do tend to go on a little bit longer, and sometimes phase 3 trials even include a so-called compassionate need arm. So after you finish the 8 weeks or whatever the initial trial phase is, you may be allowed to continue on the drug if you feel that you've had some benefit from it until the drug is actually available on the market. So phase 3 is a very exciting time, and I'm happy to say that we have some drugs now moving into phase 3 trials, at least at the planning stages for Fragile X. How long does it take? Well, phase 1 is pretty quick. It takes about 6 months. Phase 2 takes about a year, sometimes 2. And phase 3 typically takes 2 years or so. So it takes a while for these things to win their way through the system. It's very expensive, and it gets more expensive at every stage along the way. And at any time, the FDA can pull the plug or ask that you repeat studies or do the whole thing all over again. So this is one of the frustrations, but it's a very exciting time to be in the Fragile X field because it's all happening right now. Well, that's enough for now, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to answer some of those questions in future video blogs. Bye-bye.